So when you talked about individual sovereign jurisdictions actually competing for citizens, that itself seems to be an aspect of capitalism in a way, kind of keeping them honest, right? If they are
Yes.
overly oppressive or overbearing on their citizens will move on to other jurisdictions, so they'll lose customers, effectively losing taxpayers. Um, does this mean then that so it seems like the free market would be the best, um, still struggling for a term here, the best system for maintaining the sovereign interests of the most people. But there are situations that you're alluding to here that the market cannot provide for. And I talked to Weinstein the other day about this. He was talking about situations of market failure. And this
Right.
is a term, maybe I'm just overweighted in libertarianism, but I don't know a lot about market failure. But that seems like a place where the state would be especially relevant or valuable. Are there certain circumstances that come to mind immediately where markets just aren't satisfactory and the state is preferred?
Sure. So, for example, I'll give like 3 or 4 examples. One of them is actually an interesting, it's sort of a meta example. Are you familiar with of course, Uber, but are you familiar with Sidecar?
I'm not.
So Sidecar was actually an Uber competitor. It was actually started, I believe, before Uber. And they had a feature in it where every driver could set their own price. Okay. So it was further towards the independent contractor model. And what happened was that was defeated in the market by Uber, which just centrally set a price based on its knowledge of buyers and sellers and what the market would bear. It had a broader context than those individual peer-to-peer decisions. It's the opposite of the Hayekian argument that local context will always produce the best decisions. This is global context in a database where this guy, the server has a bird's eye view and can actually set a price that is more likely to be market clearing than the sort of rug merchant, like a rug merchant, you'll go and offer X and they'll come back with Y. That actually added so much time overhead that it meant that Sidecar was not used as much as Uber. And so Uber was used. Okay, right. So that's an example of what I would consider a pretty, you can argue that's a market failure. You can argue it's also not because, well, that market is contained within the larger market of picking Sidecar versus Uber, picking these two apps, right? And that gets back to the question of like free choice and citizens. But at least on a micro scale, I think that's one example. Okay. Another example is, the concept of externalities. You might have willing buyer and willing seller, but it might harm the public at large. You have, for example, there's a class example is pollution. You have a guy who's got a factory and a guy next door who's got a river, and maybe those two even can do a bilateral agreement to dump the pollutants in the river. But everybody downstream of that has a collective interest in not drinking that polluted water because it's not simply on this guy's property. It's not fully sandboxed and enclosed. There's bleed over into other people. It gets back to the, swinging your fist and hit somebody else's face, right? Mm-hmm. Now, the issue, of course, is that that's one thing when you talk about pollution, but in San Francisco, people will block neighboring developments because of shadows. You set up a building and it causes shadows on the neighbor, and that's an externality. So they feel that they have an ability to go and stop you from building. And at first that seems ludicrous, but on the other hand, you can sort of be like, hey, I had my little thing I could go and sun on, and that was very valuable to me. And that's actually why I bought this place. And now you've got this thing over here, which turned my sunny balcony into the oppressive, whatever. I mean, the shadows of some gigantic condominium, and it took away the spirit of the neighborhood. So you start to get into more gray and fuzzy areas when you start talking about externalities. But that, at least in pollution, that's like a cut and dried example. And then a third example is war. And this is one that I think goes extremely deep, which is if you have two societies, and this is actually something where I think, as Bitcoin aficionados, we should think about, which is if you have two societies and one of them can deficit spend and borrow from tomorrow to buy all of these guns today, and the other one can't, the first society might kill and outlive the second because it's able to just direct more force.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and so the problem with that is it's like a beggar thy neighbor argument, you know, where it is a race to the bottom in a sense, where the one that has, and one way of thinking about this, if you look at the US government's debt to GDP ratio during World War II, it like spiked to this insane level. And it's kind of like, you know, a bunch of boxers in the ring. And just to kind of use a metaphor, which one of them is going to take some, maybe, you know, some hard, I think there's actually good steroids, potentially. There's potentially drugs that could give you the benefits without the harm. But let's assume that there's only bad steroids. Which one of them will take the bad steroid that'll let them knock the other guy out today, but they pay the price for it tomorrow? That's an issue where having long time preference, having a constrained state, it may actually not be able to break the rules and win today. And if you don't win today, there is no tomorrow. And thus the short time preference state knocks out and kills the long time preference one.